Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I'm here for my LPL Week 5 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. It has been a little bit of a day, as you guys will probably notice if you're watching this on time, as it comes out, I should say. It's being released a little bit later and being recorded a little bit later than normal. Not only is it a day late, but it's a couple of hours late. I woke up this morning incredibly sick. You could probably hear it in my throat. It is very difficult to talk, so if you hear my energy start to fade as we start to get into these more long-winded analysis sections, that's going to be why. The analysis is still going to be good. The words that I'm saying are still going to be good, but the enthusiasm, the loudness might not be there for this episode, so I apologize for that. But, you know, we're still going to be going through all 7 days of LPL action here in week number 5. I'm really excited to go through it. There were a lot of interesting games this week. Of course, the LPL is very, very competitive, not only at the top, but basically all the way through the middle as well, and so a lot of really good games to cover here. If you are excited, let me know down in the comment section below, and let me know which game, which series you were most excited for, and did it live up to your expectations? Did anybody overperform, underperform your expectations this week? I'd love to hear about all of that down in the comment section below, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Of course, if you're new to the channel, what we do here is cover all 7 games of LPL action over the course of the week, and I'm really, really excited to do so. So let's not waste any more time. Let's jump right into day number 1 of week 5, and we kicked off week number 5 with a matchup between two teams that are sitting at 1 and 4 in Ultra Prime and LGD Gaming. And Ultra Prime walked away with a 2-0 series win. Now, it certainly wasn't nearly as dominant as you may think, looking at a 2-0 series win. Game number 1, while being incredibly fun to watch and having, you know, a pretty historic landmark moment in LPL history, was a complete and utter mess from both teams, and quite frankly, you know, not very good League of Legends, but at the end of the day, somebody ended up winning, and then game number 2, a lot cleaner, something that I can get into a tad bit more. Ultra Prime was definitely a little bit up and down in this series, but overall, they are significantly more talented than a team like LGD, and so they're really able to kind of push the boundaries of where the series is going and really show up and show out with just basically their mechanical skill, even though they're making a few mistakes here or there. My player of the series, kind of difficult to go to here. There are 3 players that I think all really deserve it and kind of get shouts out. I think Ning got player of the game for both of the games on broadcast, and while he was good, he wasn't necessarily the one that I think I was focusing on the most. That for me was Doggo in the bot lane. I was really, really proud and impressed with how Doggo played, especially game number 2 here. Bot lane was by far the biggest difference, in my opinion, that Ultra Prime had over LGD in this series. We'll talk about game number 1. If for those of you who didn't watch it and didn't see, this is the first game in LPL history, maybe even like a major region history, where it was 2 pentakills in the same game by 2 different players. Both Ching and Doggo had a pentakill in game number 1 because it was just a fiesta every single second after 20 minutes. Some of the worst macro play that I've seen from both teams in a very long time, but you know what? Shout out to Ultra Prime. They were able to win a lot of the team fights. It still took them forever to close out that game, considering how ahead they were, but, you know, shout out. They still were able to do it. Doggo's positioning on the Zeri was really strong. This is a champion that I do think plays to his strengths, and I think he was able to capitalize on that well. Doggo, in my opinion, easily the best player on this Ultra Prime team over the course of the year so far. I know I've been relatively up and down on Doggo in terms of what he's been able to offer at an LPL level over the past few years, but he is incredibly talented. He's one of the better late-game team-fighting AD carries to kind of be in this zone of teams. There aren't a lot of players like that are going to be down, you know, below like the number 11 or 12 team in the power rankings, and so to have a player like that on Ultra Prime just gives them a leg up from a lot of these other teams around them. The biggest problem Doggo has is that he'll sometimes just be in the wrong spot. He plays way too aggressive, sometimes gets himself killed for no reasons. And that happened in this series a little bit, but for the most part, he was so much better than LPC that it just didn't really matter. Shout out to Ching. He was the worst player in the LPL last week. He's been really bad in the LPL to start the year, but he was pretty good in this series. Obviously, was the other player to get a pentakill in game number 1 on the Rise, but outside of that, he really didn't have a massive impact on the series. Actually, Hai Chao was fine. On the other side, it was a relatively even mid-lane matchup. Ching was just on the better team, and then Ning, like I said, was really good, especially in that game 2 on the Vibe. That's where I really think he stood out. His game number 1 macro was bad, even if he was able to do a good job of rebounding, you know, from Meteor, having some early plays on the Elise. But overall, I would say Ultra Prime is fine, not necessarily a team that I'm really, like, all in on, but not a team that I'm all out on either. And then for LGD on the other side, they're just kind of what we think they have been over the course of the beginning of the year here. They have some talent, but they're certainly not a team that is going to be at all competitive in the LPL. That really does feel like it runs like 13-ish teams deep right now. Having a team like LGD that doesn't really come together in that same kind of way. They certainly don't have the same kind of cohesion that I think a lot of the other teams in the LPL do right now. It's just going to be hard for them to be able to pick up wins, even against a team that is struggling like Ultra Prime. Like I said, game number 1, there were moments where they looked okay. Haicho, in particular, looked really solid. He looks like this team's best player by a considerable margin over the beginning of the season, but outside of that, really not a lot of positives. I still think they have the weakest top side in the entire league with Xiaoshu and Meteor, even weaker than AL, who I think, you know, obviously Xiao Hao's a really good player. I think he accommodates a lot for that top jungle duo, and I think Xiaoshu and Meteor are just worst. They're the worst in the league, and then LPC and Jinjiao had a really bad series here. LPC got completely destroyed by Doggo in a lot of these 2v2 laning stages, and really had no, like, noticeable impact on the game. Goes to the Sivir to try and be a little bit more useful in the late game teamfights as opposed to the Varus from game number 1, and just loses so hard in the laning phase that the Sivir can never really get online anyways. So LPC's gonna get my dud of the series, but realistically speaking, this goes to the entirety of LGD, who just aren't very good as a team. They're really not all that surprisingly bad. We kind of expected this, but overall, LGD are who we think they are. They are a 1-5 team. They have won 3 games the entire year so far. 3-11 is not a particularly good record. They are probably the least talented team in the entire league, and I don't even think it's really all that close. I know, obviously, a team like AL really struggles to pick up wins, but LGD, just generally speaking, struggles in talent, and they're not really going to be able to go into a lot of these other teams. Even a team like Ultra Prime that really has been struggling, you can really see the gap in how a team like LGD actually plays versus a team like Ultra Prime. But for UP, this is a really good win. They're second to the year. They basically want to get every single one that they can because they've been very few and far between in 2023 so far. Doggo is stepping up. When they win, he looks good. When they don't win, he looks a little bit bad. I don't think anybody else in this team has really stood out. Top lane is essentially irrelevant. Ning looked good in this series. I say with a little bit of question marks. Had some good moments. Had some bad moments. Same for Ching. Balam was pretty okay. Overall, I would say Ultra Prime really relies on Doggo to carry games, especially towards the back half. When he can do it, this team wins. When he can't, this team probably is going to lose, and overall, that's kind of where they sit. I don't really think this changes my opinion on Ultra Prime all that much. They're still going to be around number 15, but a second win on the year, especially with how the LPL is going right now, is certainly not a bad accomplishment to have on your resume. Moving on to our second series now of day number 1. We had an interesting matchup. 2 teams that are kind of on the cusp of being in that top 10 right now, as we saw OMG taking on Rare Adam, and Rare Adam picking up another really strong victory here. This is a team that has been a little bit up and down, I would say, over the course of the year so far, but the top-end talent that they have when they do win games and when they are able to perform has actually been incredibly strong, and I've actually been really, really impressed with a couple of players on this team in particular. Going into the year, there was a lot of talk, of course, around Leon. There always is in terms of his ability to take over games. He's a very good jungler from ahead, not necessarily someone you want playing from behind a ton here. And there was a lot of hype coming into the year for Awesome as well in the bot lane. Some people were saying he was hard stuck on LGD last year, and well, I thought he was good. I wasn't necessarily sure exactly what we were going to get from him now that he was going to a team with a little bit more of an expectation to win now. I've always liked Cube in the top lane. He was the player that I felt the most comfortable with on Rare Adam, but it was everything else that I was still a little up in the air on. But really, the player that we have to talk about that has been genuinely fantastic for Rare Adam and has shown that he can maybe even be a superstar in this league in a few years, or maybe even right now, who knows, is Strive in the mid lane, who has just been awesome. He is a player that I've really liked over the past year or so. I've kind of grown into liking him. He was someone who I was a little bit meh on going into summer of last year, but it felt like he got better and better and better as the games went on. I talked about that a lot in my weekly reviews last year for the LPL, and he has started off 2023 with an absolute bang. He has been basically the single best player on Rare Adam in every single win that this team has had, including this series going up against a team in OMG that I really like, that I think is very talented. To see Strive really show up and play really well into another really good mid laner in this league in Cream, I think is very impressive to say the least. Strive is my player of the series. He was awesome. Obviously, the Ahri game 1 was really good, but it's the Akali game 3 that really stands out as being absolutely sensational. He really is just able to be everywhere he needs to be on the map, basically at any given time. Going into Cream, playing some of his more famous champions, I would say. Obviously, no Akali coming out from Cream in this series, but he does get the Yone, he does get the Sylas, 2 of the things that we do kind of associate with him, the melee mids, if you will. Strive just kind of takes that in stride, if you will, and really just kind of outclasses him. Not to say that Cream had a bad series. I thought he was one of the better performing members of OMG, generally speaking, over the course of the series, but Strive was just awesome. He was just better than everybody on OMG in this series, and he absolutely deserves player of the series for that. He has genuinely been one of the best players in the league when he is on so far in 2023, or at least that's what I've seen on tape. I thought Leon was really good, made some pretty big mistakes in game number 2 where he basically threw away the game for Rare Adam and caused them to lose very early on, but in their wins in games 1 and 3, he was really solid. Leon is Leon. He's going to be great in wins. He's going to be awful in losses. He's just this incredibly feast or famine player that when it works is going to be solid. Cube is really good in the top lane, especially on these more passive picks. Things like the Sante, things like the Scion, things that can just scale into the late game. He's going to feel super comfortable on that. And then honestly, a player that I really want to shout out, perhaps the second best player on this team in this series was actually Southwind in the support position, someone who I've been very critical of over the past few years. I think Southwind is, very much teetering on even being an LPL caliber support at all, but he played really well in this series. I like the Ashe in the game 1, I like the Heimer in the game 3. I thought both were relatively good for him, and easily his best series of the year by far. This was the first series where he genuinely looked like a playable support at an LPL level, and that's a good sign. But for Rare Adam, taking down a team like OMG, OMG's not exactly like a top tier team in the league, but there's certainly no pushover. So to see them come out and play as well as they did, I think is a really good sign. As for OMG on the other side, not necessarily a bad showing. Again, you had one really solid game in this series in game number 2, but at some point this team really does need to start winning games against some of these meh-tier teams. Like, they weren't able to beat RNG, who was really on a free fall after that series. They are not able to beat a team like Rare Adam here. You really need to put yourself in a position where you can take advantage when other teams are giving you opportunities to win. OMG haven't necessarily been that team over the course of the year so far, and that's a little disappointing. Obviously, I was very high on this team going into the year. I loved their core last year in 2022, and adding PB God just felt like a straight upgrade. I felt like this was the year that they finally had everything click together. It really hasn't, officially locked in yet. I certainly don't think they've been bad, and we'll talk about them a bit here, but this series wasn't great. I'm going to give Aki my dud of the series here in the jungle. He's very hit or miss, very similar to Leon. I actually think he's relatively consistent in their wins, but he's just going to get outskilled sometimes. I do think he's probably the player with the least amount of upside on OMG in terms of the whole roster. Players like Shanji, Cream, Abel, we've been talking about them being carry-oriented, strong players for quite a long time now. Aki is a good facilitator, I think, for those players, not necessarily a superstar in that regard, and so to go into a player like Leon, who I think is just going to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how he plays the game, especially if you're Aki and you're going to have to play the game from behind. I feel like that is a relatively bad sign overall for you, and I don't think he had a very good series on a couple of facilitators here in Maokai and Sejuani. But like I said earlier, Cream got outplayed in the mid lane. Even if he was okay in a lot of these team fights, he needed to be better than Strive, and he wasn't. Abel was nothing in this series, played some Ezreal, played some Lucian, played some Varus. Didn't really ever feel like he mattered all that much. And then similar for Shanji in the top lane, going into Cube, who I think is just a really solid top laner, someone who you're not going to be able to exploit in that same way. Shanji kind of knew that. He played some Scion, played some Gastante. A lot of these games were on the mid and bot lane, and they just weren't able to keep up. They weren't able to be nearly as strong as they would need to be in order to win the series. So overall, not a great series from OMG. You were able to dominate game number 2, but outside of that, there really wasn't a point where you really felt all that good against a team that I think you should just be better than. So, not going to freak out about OMG, but they may not be the top 10 team that I think they should be going into the year. A team that made playoffs last year, that felt like they were on an upward trajectory. They really just don't seem to have it so far in 2023. That's not a problem. It's not something that they cannot fix, but certainly not the way I think they wanted to start off the year so far as we head into week number 5. And then for Rare Adam, another solid win. You're actually sitting at 4-2 record-wise. I know your game record isn't nearly as good at 8-7, nearly 500, but Rare Adam is a sneakily okay team in the league right now, a team that genuinely could compete for top 10. That's why I said I really do believe that the LPL is about 13-ish deep right now. I think you could argue 14, but for me, it's 13 or so deep, and Rare Adam definitely encapsulates that here with a big win over OMG. If Strive continues to play the way that he is playing right now, he is legitimately one of the more entertaining and high-performing mid laners in the entire region. If he keeps that up, this RA team is certainly going to surprise some teams that are above them in the power rankings. It's just going to be about the rest of the team, and if they can keep up with that level of performance. I still need to see a lot more out of Awesome and Southwind. They had a good series here, but this was easily their best of the year, and I don't think they've really been all that impressive yet. Leon is super hit or miss, super feast or famine. He's got to get more consistent. I like Cube, but there are question marks on RA. Even though I think they've been playing really well, and I really do like Strive as a prospect, I'm really starting to grow into him. There are question marks about this team being top 10, but this is a series that I think points you in the direction of feeling a lot more comfortable with that idea. Moving on now to our second day here of LPL games, and we kicked off day 2 with one of the most interesting matchups of the week, a battle of two teams that only have one series loss on the year each. We had Top Esports taking on Invictus Gaming, and Top Esports does get the job done. I know IG is a very popular team right now. You should know me might be one of the most popular players in the world with how he has played at the beginning part of the year, but we got to keep expectation in mind when it comes to this IG team. I really have gotten a lot less pushback than I thought I would get, if I'm being entirely honest, from having IG ranked as low as 7 in my power rankings, even after how they have played at the beginning part of the year, going 11-2 in their first few games. I think a lot of people really associate them with potentially being a top 4 team, and while I do think that there is a realistic world in which they are there, I still think that there are some question marks about this team's longevity and, you know, about their ability to go up against some of the best competition in the league, and this top esports series was a really good test to see how that was going to turn out. Obviously, their series against EDG was really good and a great step in the right direction, but top esports on a paper level is a little bit higher rated than that, and we did see quite a few of the flaws that Invictus had in this one. My player of the series, a couple options for it, honestly, but I am going to give to Tian in the top lane because that Renekton in game number 3 was utterly brilliant. I know we can talk about the game 2 and it not really being a great game 2 coming out from him. You should know me doing a good job on the Fiora to kind of neutralize him in that one, but it is really hard not to be a huge fan of how he played this game number 3 and, quite frankly, how he dominated a player like You Should Know Me. This is a player that has gotten a ton of criticism over the beginning of the year so far. A lot of people saying that he will be the reason this team misses Worlds or some sort of narrative variation on that, but I think when you overall look at what he has been able to perform like in the LPL so far this year, a lot of it has been good. It's really not been, you know, this disaster in the top lane like people think it has been. He's had some bad games, but overall, I think he's been a relatively decently positive impact to top esports, kind of similar to what Wayward was last year. I thought his problems were also a little bit overblown in terms of his ability to play in lane and to play in structure. I thought for the most part, he was fine. It was just like the big games where he was really bad. I'm not going to say that's what Tian's going to be, but he's been really good in a lot of these regular series in the regular season, and this was a great example of that. Going up against one of the most hyped top laners in the league and utterly destroying him in a game 3 is a really, really good look for a player like that. So he's going to get my player of the series. The other player that you have to shout out here is Tian in the jungle. I know I'm lower on Tian, generally speaking, but he's still one of the best junglers in the entire world. When he gets some of these more aggressive carries that can do something a little bit early, the Elise in game number 1 definitely comes to mind. He can really just take over the game and win it basically instantly. He gets the Maokai in game 3, and he does a great job of setting up top lane to be a complete disaster for the Fiora very early on. Shout out to Tian against Gideon in particular. Gideon is much more of that supportive type of jungler, someone who isn't going to play things like the Elise. At least that's what we thought going into the series. Obviously, he plays the Elise here in game 3. We will get to that, but so to see Tian come out and really try to punish that early on, I do think was a really good idea from top esports, and it really went over well. I think those were the two best players in the series, especially when the games really counted there in game number 3, but also, of course, big shout out to Rookie. He might just be the best Jace in the LPL regardless of position, and that really shows you why it was kind of questionable for them to give it to Tian in the game number 2 here, because Rookie's Jace is so ridiculously good, and it's really difficult to play into. I mean, Dove tried it on the Azir, didn't work. Tried it on the Yone, it didn't work. He didn't really have a lot of opportunity to be able to compete with it because of the range in the early game, being able to just kind of get the ball rolling when it comes to him and his jungle and creating that on-map pressure that Jace naturally can give you from the mid lane from winning early, and then also transitioning that into ridiculous amounts of damage late game. Rookie's just really good. The top 3 on this team definitely carried it in this series. It's a really good sign when you have Jackie Love and Mark kind of being the least relevant players on your team. That really shows, I think, that the top side was doing a good job. As for Invictus, rough loss here. My dud of the series is going to go to Gideon. He just had a really bad game number 3 on Elise. Way too passive for my liking. Obviously, I've talked a bit about how I think Elise as an early game jungler is a little bit overblown in terms of how she plays the game. I would consider her damage never really to fall off. It's just her survivability that becomes a lot more difficult to actually deal with. Early on in games, you don't really have a lot of ways to blow her up incredibly quickly, but when something like Jace gets online, it's a lot easier to do so, but you still got to take advantage of that early power spike that Elise does offer you, and Gideon wasn't able to do that. Now, I do want to say it does seem like there was some sort of draft problem, that the Elise was not meant to be the pick in the jungle here, but it was, and I don't know if that was an issue or if it was on accident or whatever, but they ended up having to play with it, and they should have been able to transition that into some level of early success, especially going into a Maokai. They just were not able to do that. So Gideon's going to get my dud of the series. He wasn't particularly good in game number 1 either. But of course, You Should Know Me got dominated in that game number 3 on the Fiora. Really bad from him, even if he was good the rest of the series. And then Dove wasn't particularly good compared to someone like Rookie. On and Wink weren't on the same level of Jackie Love and Mark. It just felt like a good team, not necessarily a great team. And Invictus just kind of being a little bit outskilled by the overall talent that a team like Top Esports has. It's not the worst loss in the world for IG. I predicted this. It's not particularly surprising. It is good to see that this team is relatively human. It'll be interesting to see how they bounce back from this. This is a team that really hasn't been, you know, I don't want to say tested in that way. Like, they've lost a series before, but they haven't been tested in the same way that they're going to be tested here. And, like, can they bounce back this week to kind of get back on track, you know, prove that they are, like, a top 5-6 team in the league? Because losing to top doesn't necessarily knock you out of that conversation. It's all going to be about how you respond here. And then for Top Esports, you still look really, really good. I mean, this could be the number 1 or 2 team in the league. They just are incredibly talented. They do have some major question marks. Wow, Tian was really good in this series. He hasn't been perfect over the years so far. You know, Jackie Love and Mark can certainly win or lose you some games, but on paper, talent-wise, this is one of the best teams in the entire world, and honestly, it's just really good to see them perform like that, even against a team like Invictus. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 2, we had a little bit of an upset. Not really an upset if you know the team involved, but definitely an upset in terms of talent level. We had ThunderTalk Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming, and ThunderTalk picking up the 2-0 win. TT's really starting to come into their own. They started the year 0-2. They're now 4-2. They're 4-0 in their last 4 series. An incredibly impressive rebound from a really rough start to the year for a ThunderTalk team that people genuinely did have relatively good expectations of. Ever since Yao Yao came to support, I said that this team has really changed how they played the macro game. I'm not sure if he's the one making all of the shot calls or if it's just a confidence thing. I really don't know what it is, but this ThunderTalk team is really clicking on all cylinders right now, and being able to beat a team in Weibo that just took down JD Gaming, what most people consider to be easily the most talented team in the entire world, that's a pretty big win for ThunderTalk, and quite frankly, a pretty expected loss for Weibo. You beat JD Gaming and you lose to ThunderTalk. That sounds like how this team would work. But let's go ahead and talk about how TT won this series in 2. Both of these games were relatively TT favored, especially game number 1, which was really ThunderTalk favored. Game 2 certainly had some moments, but I have to give a huge shout out to Beishwan in the jungle. I know we've been, you know, relatively hard on him over the course of the year so far. ThunderTalk has a really talented 18-year-old jungler that is kind of coming through the system right now. A lot of people see him as kind of like the big long-term starter for ThunderTalk, but ever since they have kind of said, well, we're probably going to him this year, Beishwan's really stepped up his game, and he's really played at a high level. He was just better than Karsa in both of these games by a large margin. Now, Karsa obviously not the most consistent jungler in the world, but he's been having a really good year, despite what Reddit will tell you, and Beishwan, I think, really just genuinely outperformed him here. He was really, really solid. Definitely enough for my player of the series. I think both Game 1 and Game 2 were really dominated in that jungle matchup by ThunderTalk, and then big shout out to the solo laners. They were awesome here. Obviously, Yukao's been really good to start the year. I think probably the most underrated player in the entire LPL to start the year, because I think that he has genuinely been one of the most consistently positive players for any team, and yet I've heard almost no one mention his name in terms of players that are performing well so far in 2023. I think Yukao has definitely stepped up and made ThunderTalk a legitimately strong team in the mid game, because I think some of these other players are a little bit in the mid game, but Yukao's been very good at that part. And then big shout out to Hoya in the top lane as well. Multiple solo kills in this series against the Shy. Obviously, we'll get to the Shy. Not a good series from him, but Hoya has honestly been fine. He's had some poor moments, I would say, over the past year or so, but I think he's been much better for ThunderTalk than he ever was for a team like Damwon in the LCK, and it's really good to see him get another shot on a genuinely good team and actually be able to perform. Huanfeng and Yao Yao were also solid. They just weren't necessarily the focal points. Very similar to what I was talking about with TES in the previous series, but for Weibo on the other side, frustrating loss. I mean, your top side just played bad. There really is no other way to put it. The Shy and Karsa were not good in this series. I feel really bad for Light in particular. We'll talk about Crisp in a second as well. He was also pretty bad, but I feel bad for Light in particular, who was actually really good at outputting a lot of damage in these games. His damage numbers were incredibly high. He was in really good positions. He was actually doing really well in lane. It just never mattered. This very much felt like 2022 LNG Light, where it was like, oh, he's playing really well. No one else on this team is. So that's a little bit unfortunate, but we got to talk about this top side. The Shy is going to get my dud of the series. Anybody who watched these games is going to agree with that. He was solo killed multiple times in this game number 2. Just a pathetic performance coming out from him. He accomplished basically nothing the entire series. This is genuinely one of the worst top lane performances I've seen in the world this year. It really was that bad. But that's the Shy. I mean, that's what you get with him. He's going to have some series where he's really good. More specifically, he's going to have some games where he's really good, and then he's going to have some games, maybe some series where he's not so good. You know, I've been on the vocal train of I think the Shy is a little bit more trouble than he's worth, especially for a top team in the league. Of course, the upside that he gives you is incredibly high, but You're really asking for a lot of problems when you hitch your wagon to the Shy in terms of what he's able to output, and that was definitely shown off here. Going up against Hoya, who's not like a particularly phenomenal top laner, just an average at best top laner in the LPL, and getting absolutely steamrolled like this, not particularly good. Karsa had a bad series, couldn't save anybody from bad laning. Xiaohu wasn't particularly good either. Honestly, Weibo just felt like they collapsed. This felt like, you know, the bad version of what this team could possibly be. We've talked about it when it comes to Weibo. They probably, you know, are one of the more talented teams in the entire world. Xiaohu, the Shy, Karsa, Light, Crisp, like, when they're all clicking, you know, they are genuinely a team that I think can beat anybody. Literally anyone in the world. If they beat JDG, they can beat anybody, but when they're not clicking, they suck, and that is relatively common. This is a very volatile team. Crisp played Enchanter Heimerdinger. I'm talking like Mikhail's Heimerdinger. What's even the point of playing Heimerdinger if you're going to build Enchanter? I just don't understand. So just a lot of weird decisions made by Weibo, and they absolutely did not work out here. I think overall, it's hard to get a grasp on where to rank this team in terms of the power rankings. I had them at number 2. I've had them at number 4. You know, kind of going back and forth there. Talent-wise, they're number 1 or number 2 in the entire league, but consistency-wise, they are nowhere close to top 4, and that's what really concerns me. I think at their best, this could be a team that is lifting the LPL trophy at the end of the year. At their worst, this could be a team that is, like, not even top 4, and so big variance coming in from them, and that definitely showed itself in this series again. And then ThunderTalk, they've really been on a roll. It is very exciting to see this team start to get their footing. I think that there are a lot of good teams in the LPL right now, but ThunderTalk is absolutely one of them. They could be one of the big teams that surprises, and they could finally break that ThunderTalk playoff curse here, especially if this bot lane continues to grow. I think the bot lane is like the big star point. Yukao's been incredibly consistent here. Beishuan's been really good in the jungle, and obviously, even if he's not, they have that superstar young jungler. They have a lot of really good things going for them right now. My hope, and I think a lot of other fans in the LPL's hope, is just that they're going to be able to keep it up, because this is a very easy and fun team to root for. That's going to bring us into day number 3 now, and we kicked off day 3 with a pretty good team against a team that is really struggling right now. We had Anyone's Legend taking on Bilibili Gaming, and BLG does pick up the win. They hadn't exactly been the most consistent team in the LPL up until this week. Obviously, last week, week number 4 for BLG certainly wasn't ideal. They dropped all the way to number 6 in my power rankings after pretty definitively being a top 4 team on paper through the first couple of weeks, but a series against Anyone's Legend is certainly there to turn basically anyone around in the LPL. It seems like a lot of these regions have a team where it's just like, thank God I finally get to play against them. You know, DRX in the LCK, Dignitas in the LCS, Excel, or even Fnatic, I guess, for that matter, in the LEC. There are a lot of options, but in the LPL, it is absolutely Anyone's Legend, and that came true here. Although AL was able to take game number 2, and it was a little bit interesting, BLG just was the better team, and a lot of that was off the back of the bot lane here, which just continues to look really solid for BLG overall and in general. Elk is going to get my player of the series here. Elk has been really good on BLG. I would argue, other than Bin, Elk has probably been the best player on BLG this year, and Bin himself has had some bad games. Elk really hasn't had any bad games, just Bin has been exceptional in some of their wins. Elk has also been very good in some of their wins, and that carries over here. I've always been very high on Elk. Go watch a lot of my spring analysis from 2022. I know we started to not talk about Ultra Prime towards the back half of the year when they brought in Zoom and everything really fell apart, but even in spring, like, this was a team that was getting hard carried by how good Elk was playing, especially in the mid game of a lot of their games. And now that the meta, I think, is super bot lane focused, very similar to what it was towards the end of last year, you know, after Elk, I think, had mentally checked out on that Ultra Prime team. Now that he's got teammates surrounding him, he's got a really good support that is going to play a little aggro with him. He's got a jungler that's willing to try to make plays, a top laner that can win 1v1. I really do think that he could be primed for an all-pro MVP caliber season, and he's kind of performing at that level right now. So big credit to Elk. He's my player of the series. The other player you got to shout out here is June in the jungle. A good jungle performance from him. Obviously, he can be very up and down. We've seen that over the course of the year so far. Some good games, some bad games. This was mostly good games against a very good jungler in Xiaohao, or at least a good jungler in Xiaohao. I know the scoreline doesn't necessarily represent that on the side of AL, but I will get to that in a second. I actually thought he was really good in this series, but June was just a tad bit better. Overall, BLG looking okay. You would have liked them to have taken 2 games in a row against AL, who is, I mean, really struggling. 0-7 to start the year, but still, winning the series is a good thing, especially after how they looked over the course of the last series that they played in the last week or so. This is definitely a big improvement from that, just from the fact that they were able to close out games in the first place. As for AL, they suck. There really is no other way to put it. I can't sugarcoat this. They suck. They got destroyed in game 1. Game number 3 was a disaster. I have to just sit here and say, I get it. Game number 2 was fine for the bot lane. Betty and Sword Art certainly had good moments in game 2 on that Lucian Nami, but they single-handedly lost game number 3. I don't know how to not give dud of the series to one of them. They both absolutely deserve dud of the series. If just for game number 3, they completely throw away Xiao Hao's game, basically from a level 1, and then Xiao Hao does a great job of not only rebounding his lane, but rebounding bot lane, and then they immediately throw it away again, and Elk gets super fed on this Zeri with a Yuumi, with a Wukong for initiation, with the Gwen for frontline, and there's just no way to win the game. It is completely on Betty and Sword Art, who have just been bad. Sword Art's going to get my dud of the series because I think he was more egregious with his positioning mistakes, and I thought Betty was slightly more impactful with how he was able to win game number 2, but both of them were so ridiculously bad in their losses that it's almost exceptional that they still have starting jobs here in the LPL. I think that could be the big area that this team looks at to kind of make some changes if they do want to make changes early. Now, obviously, Betty and Sword Art have been good in the past. Betty has been relatively consistent for this AL team over the past year or so. Sword Art, not so much, hasn't been particularly good since coming back from North America. But, you know, I understand wanting to give them more time. I also understand looking at a performance like this and just saying it's not worth it. Because, really, I mean, if they're going to give you this, it's not worth it. They don't have upside, and they're not playing well right now. And so, the leash is definitely short for the bot lane when it comes to me. Everybody else on the team wasn't that particularly good either. They were just the ones that I think stood out as being awful. I thought Pins was actually better than he had been in previous series. Higal's not exactly lighting the world on fire in 2023, and I think Pins did a good job staying relatively even with him in laning phase. Xiao Hao had some really bad moments, but he also had some really good moments in game number 3 where he was really looking like he was going to bring that game back for AL. Obviously, the rest of the team kind of throws it away, but Xiao Hao is still by far and away the best player on this team, and he's elo held into oblivion. Overall, AL is still AL. They lost this series. They have some good players, but they're never really going to be able to put together a genuinely good series. It just doesn't seem like this team is there right now mentally. Hopefully they can figure something out, but they're the worst team in the league by a considerable margin, and that really didn't change at all in this series. For BLG, again, you would have liked to have seen them win, you know, both of the first 2 games, but at least taking the series win here is big for this roster, if only because you need to get some level of confidence under their belt. Jun and Yigal still aren't entirely on the same page, but they were much better in this series. Elk and Honor looking fantastic in the bot lane as a duo, and BLG is definitely still scary on paper. Even if they're not perfect right now, they still are a team that I think could get into that top 4 conversation. I don't know if this necessarily gives me the confidence that they will do that anytime soon, but they're certainly not a team that deserves to fall out of the top 10 like some people were clamoring for last week. Moving on now to our second series here of day number 3, and it's another battle between 2 top teams, 2 top 4 teams, in my opinion, both with only 1 loss on the season. We had JD Gaming taking on Edward Gaming, and EDG picking up a super big win here. Being able to beat JDG is not easy, but EDG have been overperforming every expectation that anybody set for them all year long so far. They've had a lot of players that have really stepped up and played at a super high level, and they proved again here that they are just as talented and they deserve just as much recognition as basically anybody in the LPL right now, whether that be JDG or Weibo or Top Esports. It doesn't matter. EDG is right up there with all of them. Another really good series. Let's go ahead and talk about what's been going right for EDG, especially in the last few weeks. I had some concerns going into the year with the volatility of especially the solo laners and generally the top side of the map that EDG was rocking with in 2023. JJ, as we all know, a very good jungler when locked in, but certainly had stretches, especially over the course of last year, where he just was not particularly good. Ale can be an incredibly strong laner, in particular in the top lane, but he's very volatile, can be relatively coin flippy, and can have some bad performances. And Fofo was coming off of what was probably the worst year of his entire career in 2022, where he ended up getting benched midway through the year on BLG. And so a lot of question marks on EDG heading into the year, and all of them have been unfounded so far in 2023. Fofo might just be the best mid laner in the LPL right now. He's legitimately playing at a phenomenal level, perfect positioning, great laning, really good macro. He has completely upped his game back to like rare Adam Fofo from a couple of years ago. And then we get to talk about my player of the series here in JJ. I think a lot of credit for EDG so far has gone to Fofo. I've seen a lot of people talking about Ale, but I think you can make a really strong case that JJ is the best player on EDG right now. I know Fofo has been fantastic, so has JJ. I understand some of those engages were maybe just a tad bit too aggressive, but you can't watch game number 2, hell, even game number 1, but especially game number 2, and not tell me that JJ completely owned the map and completely destroyed every ounce of gameplay that JDG was trying to accomplish in that one. An incredibly impressive performance from him, and he's been very consistent consistently good over the course of the beginning part of the season. It makes me believe that it really was just a confidence thing last year. We talked about this a lot when it came to EDG when we got into the playoffs, where obviously, he was benched for Junjia for a large portion of the back half of summer, and at the time, I was like, wow, Junjia makes this team better, because Junjia did make this team better. They were playing a lot through mid lane, a lot through Scout in summer, and then they switched over to playing through Viper when Junjia came in, but then JJ just came back in and was like, oh, I guess I'll play through Viper instead, and he was just better at it than Junjia, and I think that's really where we're at with EDG. As long as JJ is locked in and he has a good idea of where the resources need to go on the map and where he needs to be, his mechanical skill is just so much superior to so many other junglers in the league, and JJ absolutely deserves to be considered one of the best. Obviously, Fofo's been fantastic. I think Leave has almost been underrated with how good he's been in the bottom lane. I know a lot of people are saying, yeah, Ole, JJ, Fofo, they've been great, and Leave is getting better. I think Leave is already like a top 7 or 8 ADC in the LPL, which is a really good stat to have. I think he is someone who you can absolutely win a title with right now, and I really do think he's only going to get better. I've always been incredibly high on Leave. He was the player in the LDL I was by far the most excited to see in the LPL this year, and he's come in, and he's been really good. Obviously gets to play with Mako. That's a pretty damn good way to start a career, but everybody on EDG just feels like they're clicking right now, and it's really fun to watch. As for JDG on the other side, this super team is really starting to run into some problems. It feels like both JDG and Weibo got a little exposed in their series against each other. JDG really hasn't bounced back in the way that we've wanted them to. Kanavi's actually going to get my dud of the series here. He was just out-jungled by JJ hard. Kanavi, quite frankly, was bad in this series, and that is a little concerning. Kanavi didn't really have series like this last year. Him and Yagao felt really cohesive and really coherent as a mid-jungle duo. They didn't really slip up ever, even against some of the best teams in the entire league, all the way through playoffs, even at Worlds, they were still really strong. So to see Kanavi come out and have a really bad game like this is just not something we're used to seeing, and it really was topside that was problematic. Kanavi wasn't very good. 369 was also not very good. Ale abused him in this laning phase, and really 369's contributions to the series were just showing Ale how to play Kennen so that he could do it better in game number 2, which is insane to say, but yeah, top side of the map was really a problem for JDG, and that's definitely concerning. We know 369 can be a little coin flippy, but remember, before last year, before, 2022 Kanavi, 2021 Kanavi wasn't particularly consistent. It wasn't particularly good. That team finished, like 9th place in the LPL with good talent around him. I'm not saying that it was a perfect storm to get Kanavi back to being one of the best junglers in the world like he was in 2020, but I do want to say that it is a little bit, we have to keep in mind that Kanavi isn't just this jungler who's been perfect for 3 years and isn't going to run into problems just because he didn't last year. I still think that there are definitely some question marks. Ruler wasn't particularly good in this series, really wasn't getting a lot of damage out. Knight was just kind of meh. I do think that he was almost undervalued in the series. I think that JDG probably should have invested a lot more time and resources into Knight, but they just didn't really want to do that. And what are you really going to do as Yuumi and Heimerdinger if the rest of your team is losing? So overall, JDG definitely starting to concern me, at least in terms of being like the definitive #1 team in the league. Obviously, losing to Weibo and losing to EDG, not the 2 worst losses in the entire world, but those are series that you want to win if you want to be the best team in the world and the best team in the LPL, and I'm just not sure JDG has clicked like that yet. They looked so ridiculously dominant in their first few series. It just hasn't carried over into some of the better ones against better teams. And then for EDG, I mean, this team's legit. They are one of the best teams in the LPL, and they are a legitimate threat to be hoisting the trophy by the end of spring, which is incredible. If JJ and Fofo continue to play like this with the mid-jungle duo, they are going to be a threat to take down any team in the entire league. Ale is fantastic up on the top lane so far, and the bot lane continues to get better, whether strong side or weak side, and so very impressed with EDG. I think when it comes to all the teams that I'm thinking about being overperforming expectations, the most EDG for me so far in 2023 probably comes in at the top of that list. Now we get to move into day number 4 of LPL action, and this is where we really start to hit some of the more interesting matchups of the week. Obviously, we've seen some really good ones up until this point, but not a lot of them have been very close. It's not necessarily starting here, but some, at least better games, I would say, overall, as we kicked off day 4 with Royal Never Give Up taking on FunPlus Phoenix. A pretty historic matchup here in the LPL. Obviously, RNG, one of the most historic teams in League of Legends history. FPX had won a world title, two pretty franchised orgs, I would say, here in China, and RNG gets the better of them in this one, which is gotta be such a sigh of relief for RNG fans. This is a team that really has struggled out of the gate. 4-9 in their first 13 games is really not how I think RNG expected to kick off the season, but a couple of problems they've run into at the start of the year. Mid lane's been a problem. Getting Ming back was a little bit of an issue at the beginning of the year. Wei hasn't been playing particularly well. Breathe has had some bad games, but it's starting to come together for a team that absolutely still has the talent to be one of the better teams in the entire league, let alone the entire world. And it really was shown off a tad bit more in this series overall. My player of the series is going to go to Gala. He's been awesome this year. I mean, you could say what you want about RNG really struggling to perform early, and I agree with that. I think RNG obviously came out of the gate really, really slow, but Gala has kind of been performing, I would say, at a relatively strong level all year long so far. Easily this team's best player, and that's carried over. He has consistently been one of the best AD carries in the world for the past few years, which is crazy considering his career path, but we're all familiar with Gala now. You don't need me to go into a long description of why he is so good. I think I talked about this either last week or the week before when it came to RNG, but there aren't really a lot of players that I would consider myself like equal in opinion with a lot of the like major consensus, like with Reddit or Twitter or like the big populace. I think Gala is like the perfect spot on of like the one player that I would say me and, you know, the Reddit analysts and, you know, whoever's streaming on Twitch is, we're all kind of in the same boat when it comes to Gala. He's a very good player. He has his flaws. He's not exactly perfect. I want him to be a tad bit more aggressive in terms of how he plays some of the late game team fights, but he's gotten really good at that over the past couple of years on RNG here, and he's really just turned into a really consistent, really solid AD carry, top-level AD carry, and that is shown through over the course of this year. He had a great game on Jhin in Game 2 in particular. Really, really fantastic. Absolutely outplayed LWX and really proved that he is still the heart and soul and the driving force of this RNG team. Really the biggest change, though, I think, has to be how these solo laners performed. These positions have been problems at the beginning of the year. Breathe really hasn't been fantastic. He hasn't been bad, but he hasn't been fantastic to start the year. And the mid lane position, quite frankly, has been a little bit of a disaster, obviously, with Tongyuan in there. Angel's played a little bit, but he really hasn't had any time to, like, solidify himself in the starting lineup. He finally gets a full series here to play against FPX, and he looks pretty solid doing it. Now, I know some people are going to point out some mechanical misplays that he made, but, you know, some of them were unfortunate, luck-wise. Obviously, the play that a lot of people are going to point to is the Azir shuffle directly on top of Gala with the Kassadin that just kills Gala immediately, but first of all, watching that play, it is not Angel's fault at all. Care R's in as soon as Angel is pressing the ult button, and so he's not trying to ult him into Gala, he's trying to ult him into the wall, and it just bad timing. Care gets really lucky there, but even outside of that, some of the lane mishaps that he was going through in this game, I do think are fixable. Angel's never been a particularly strong laner. I would say that is by far his biggest weakness as a player. What he does is play really well off of junglers and do a really good job in the mid to late game of being able to scale up into something that can be useful in a more supportive role, and I think that's what this team needs. You've got carries, you've got Gala, you've got Wei. Breathe can win games for you. I thought Angel did a much better job in this series of blending into the rest of the team and just kind of being that supporting figure that they needed. And then big shout out to Breathe in the top lane. That Sion game 1 was super fun to watch, but he was much better in game number 2 as well. Obviously, FPX starting Fearness this week. This is his first start, I believe, on FPX this year. I don't remember covering him in the LPL before this. Obviously, former LGD top laner, someone who I've talked about on the channel before. He's fine. Certainly not an awful player in the top lane position, but not someone I would consider a strength, and Breathe should be able to beat him, and he did. So overall, everything just kind of going the way it should for RNG, and that's a good sign because things were not going as they should have through the first couple of weeks. So to see this is definitely positive. And then for FPX on the other end, they just aren't very good. I talked about how the top 13 teams are all relatively competitive. 14's my cutoff because it really doesn't feel like FPX is competitive with a lot of these other teams, and I think they showed that here. I'm relatively high on Care as a mid laner. I think he's fine. I think he's someone who can be a relative strength on a team in the LPL, but he had a pretty poor series here going into RNG. He was okay in lane, but his team fighting was atrocious on the Kassadin in particular in game number 2. Some really bad misplays that cost FPX a lot of those fights. LWX and Lele are just a bad bot lane. There really is no other way to put it. Obviously, LWX is a player who's been really good in the past, was really good in spring of last year when he had Hang, but let's not forget, I know a lot of people online are talking about how Lele has ruined LWX and that it's entirely Lele's fault. Let's not forget the giant downturn that LWX had in summer of last year. He was not very good in summer. In fact, he was the biggest weakness on this FunPlus Phoenix team throughout most of the back half of 2022. I think people forget about that because they were pretty good in spring, and obviously he has pedigree. He's a world champion bot laner, so you know, it's not particularly surprising to see him struggle for me here, especially when the team around him isn't really picking up the slack, but you're just really hoping that something can happen there in the bot lane because that has to be an area of positivity for you because top lane's not really going to give it. Top side is really not going to get it. Hacker's been fine, been up and down, I would say, mostly down, but he's had a couple of good games since coming in. You know, hopefully Fearness can be a little bit more efficient than Xiaolahu in that top lane, but neither is really giving you any sort of superstar level of carry potential. They're both just kind of tank players that want to play on weak side, so I really don't know where the wins on this FPX team are going to come from when their mid and ADC aren't playing at a high level. Unfortunately, this series, they just kind of got outskilled, and I'm not particularly surprised to see them drop. But they did play okay in game number 2, I will say. As for RNG, they look relatively back on track. I'm not going to completely go all in on them again as like a top 4, top 5 team like I had them as at the beginning of the year with this roster, but I am going to say that I do think they were a lot closer to being in that top 4, top 5 than they were last week, right? This is a team that I think has gotten better basically every single series that they played so far this year, and they absolutely have the talent to be a team that can compete even for an LPL trophy. And so I would expect them to continue to kind of grow, continue to get that synergy back. And by the end of the split, I would be surprised if they weren't an actual contender, like a top, 4 or 5 team. I would be surprised if they weren't somewhere in that conversation. It's just a little bit too early for me to crown them right now. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 4, we had an intriguing matchup, a team that I don't think a lot of people have as much confidence in as I do, taking on a team that I think people have more confidence in than I do. We had Team WE taking on LNG Esports, and LNG picks up the win. I've been very high on LNG. I've been relatively okay on WE. I think a lot of people are super in on this team, but I think this series kind of shows why I'm still a little bit hesitant to call them, a definite top 10 team in the LPL. This was definitely a little bit of a frustrating series for WE. Probably the biggest stomp in the LPL this year so far. This was an absolute demolition from LNG. They took way too long to close out game number 1, considering how ahead they were, but you know what? There was never a single moment in this entire series, these entire games, where they felt anything other than in complete and utter control of the game, of the series, of everything. So, credit to LNG. Let's talk about how they got there. There were a couple of options for player of the series here. I think a lot of people are going to give it to LP, and I'm going to agree with them here, if only because I do think LP played really well, and considering where he has been playing a lot of the year, I think this was a big game changer for LNG, for this LP and Hang bot lane to come out and just be better than Hope and Awandi, who, quite frankly, have been really solid for WE. They've been a big power point on the map for them. Obviously, Shanks, I think, has been the big star of WE so far this year, but Hope and Awandi have definitely done their part as well. LP and Hang coming out, having such a good series early on in the 2v2, and then being able to transition that into really strong mid-game skirmishes, I think really that's what set LNG apart in this series. It could have been a lot different if Hope and Awandi were able to generate leads, even with the rest of LNG playing really well. But the player that I really want to give a shout out to, and the player that in a lot of other circumstances I would have given player of the series to, is Tarzan in the jungle, who was just stellar. I mean, unbelievably good. His Vi game in game 1 was untouchably good. Sejuani is still one of those picks that when you give it to Tarzan, it's just going to look a little bit different than it looks on basically any other player in the world. He is that good at that champion. It's insane. Like, he's just the perfect facilitating jungler. He does everything that you would ever want and then some, and doesn't take any of the resources for himself. If you're a bot laner, if you're a mid laner, if you're a top laner, he is the king of the jungle, because you would not want anyone else roaming that position and getting you those leads, because he does it so efficiently. He's been great to start the year. Him and Scout, I was a little bit curious to see how they would mesh as a duo, what with Tarzan and Doenby not really meshing most of last year, I would say, both of them being more facilitators than they are resource-heavy carries. But Tarzan and Scout have worked incredibly well together. Scout has done a really good job of knowing when to play aggressive and when not to play aggressive. That's always been a big positive for Scout, and that's, I would argue, been his biggest strength over the course of his career on EDG. Tarzan obviously wants to give those resources somewhere. Zeke is great with resources. LP is going to get integrated a lot faster as an AD carry when he gets resources like he did in this series. Overall, LNG just feels like they have a very easy path to winning a lot of games this year. They know how they want to play the game, and teams that aren't as good as them at doing it are just going to lose. I know we're going to struggle to say that LNG is going to be a big favorite against any of the top teams, just because there are some pretty major question marks in terms of the talent difference between them and some of the best teams in the league. I think more so than almost any other team in the league, LNG is going to be consistent at beating teams like WE, beating teams in that, mid-tier range, because of the way that they play the game and because of how cohesive they are when playing together, and I think that showed through in this series. As for WE, this sucked. I mean, this was not good. No-brainer dud of the series going to Hang. Hang has been good over the course of the first couple of weeks of the season. I think he's been fine. Not necessarily a superstar in the jungle, but someone who I think does embody the LPL style of jungling, which is win early and then just try to not throw. He's not a very good mid-game jungler. That's probably his biggest weakness, and unfortunately, Tarzan does a really good job at being able to generate early leads, and Hang really has not looked good from behind at any point this year so far. I think that definitely played in here. Obviously, Shanks was pretty bad, Bubu was pretty bad, Hope and Awandi got completely outplayed by LP and Hang. Nobody on WE really looked good at all in this series, so it's hard to really point at one person in particular and say it's your fault, but I mean, going 0-7 on Wukong and then like 0-8 on Amumu, not a particularly good series overall for the rookie jungler. I still think he's okay. I think going up against Tarzan is really difficult when you're a young jungler because he's really good at taking advantage of weaknesses that other players are able to show. He's a really good exploiter, if you will. I know that sounds weird, but I think you guys get what I mean. It's just unfortunate that it had to play out like this. I still think WE is an okay team, a mid-tier team in the LPL here. Nothing extraordinary. I've kind of talked about that. They're sitting at 3-3. They've lost some games that they shouldn't lose. They've won some games that they shouldn't win. But they're sitting somewhere around 10, 11, 12 in the power rankings for me. They're a good team, just not one that I see really having the talent or the cohesion at the moment to be able to push themselves over the edge. They rely so much on Shanks being able to carry a lot of these late games, so long as Hope and Awandi do okay in the early game. Biubiu and Hang have been fine. Hang has decent early games, but sometimes he throws them, and then Biubiu is just still one of the worst top laners in the league. It's just not been nearly as egregious as it's been in previous splits. So WE is still kind of meh, but, you know, they have talent. I just obviously didn't show in this series. For LNG, though, I feel pretty good about them. They're going to be the bottom beaters of the LPL split. I don't know if they're going to be a top team again. I still think that there is a little bit of a question mark when it comes to the talent differential. Bot lane is by far the most important role in the game right now, and LP has been less than satisfactory against some of the better bot lanes. Now, him being really good against Hope, who was in the World Semifinals last year, is a really good sign, even if I am lower on Hope generally than a lot of other people. I think it shows that he has the ability to take the resources if his laners, if his other teammates are winning. I just don't know if he's going to be able to hold up against some of the best bot laners in the LPL. That's going to be the big question mark. But outside of that, this team really is good. I really like how jungle and mid are working together. Tarzan is very quietly having a phenomenal start to the split, and I think I'm just really hoping that LNG keeps the pace up because they are outperforming my expectations, and I think they are better than a lot of people are giving them credit for right now. That brings us to day number 5 now here in week 5 of the LPL, and we kicked off day 5 with another little bit of an upset, but it is a team that is performing relatively under the weather, I would say, over the course of the beginning part of the year. We have LGD Gaming taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and LGD picks up another win here. They're first in a little while, but a pretty solid one. They're second of the year, which I think is a lot more than I was giving them credit for at this point. I still think they might just be the least talented team in the league, but it doesn't really matter when other teams are giving them a lot of opportunities to be able to win games through their power players. In this case, Haichao, who I think is really impressing. He was someone who I really wasn't all that interested or impressed with last year. I thought LGD's mid lane spot, you know, they tried a couple of people out there, but I don't really think any of them really stood out to me. He's been much better in 2023, even in their losses. It definitely feels like he has stepped up, and I actually think he has been a huge strength for LGD, a player that I think could push them above, like, the 16-15 area that they have been in for a little while, especially with some other teams above them really struggling right now. But he's definitely going to earn his honors here as the player of the game, both in Game 1 and in Game 2. I mean, Game 1 was a nightmare for both teams. Nip really not being able to make it work, even though they have probably the two best performing players in the game, maybe outside of Haichao, but Invincible and Photic, I think both were really good in Game number 1. Invincible especially was really good on this Jace in Game number 1, and it's almost a crime that he wasn't able to win that game, but you're Jace, and the rest of your team is feeding, and you've only got really an Azir for a ton of late-game damage. Jhin does hurt, and Photic did a good job on Jhin, but you're really going into a Kassadin that is going to become a major problem, and they weren't just able to take it over there. So LGD takes Game 1. They have much more control in Game number 2. Haichao gets really fed on the Akali. Xiaoshu does a much better job of dealing with Invincible in Game number 2. Overall, I just think LGD was a lot more cohesive than NIP in either game in this series, and it's not what I expected. I mean, I'm probably the biggest NIP hater on the internet. This is a team that I talked about in the preseason being one that was way overhyped, and a team that I really would have been surprised if they were somewhere near like the top 6 by the end of the split. I didn't expect it to go this bad, though. I mean, this team might not even be close to top 10 right now. They replace Dream in the mid lane, they bring Pout in, he's not good. Photic is easily this team's best player, and everyone knows how I feel about Photic. He's not really someone who's going to win you games by himself. He needs a good team around him. That's how he's been his entire career. Shuo has had moments where he's looked good. Xiaolin Bao has had moments where he's looked good. Invincible has had moments where he's looked good, but this team just has no cohesion. They have no synergy, and they have no consistency, and it's becoming a massive problem for them. As good as Haichao played in this series, they should have had, like, full control of this. There is no excuse for NIP not being the better team here, because it looked like they got outskilled by LGD, which is a problem. That should just not be happening. So dud of the series was a little bit difficult to pick here, but I ended up going with Xiaolin Bao. It felt like he had zero impact on the series really at all, and that's not good going into Meteor, who's been one of the worst junglers in the entire league so far this year. especially compounding that in game 1 where you had your top laner super far ahead, you had your bot laner in a relatively decent spot, and you were going for some of these engages on Wukong that were just inty, like they were just throwing the game away. I don't really know what NIP was going for in a lot of these engages. Xiao and Bao wasn't good. I thought Pout wasn't good. You can look at his scoreline and see it as okay, but Haiqiao had full control of that lane and had complete control of the game. And then Shuo just did nothing in either of these games, especially on the Ashe in game number 2. NIP just feels like a team that is lacking anything right now. Fodic really needs to step up in order for this team to win games. And even then, I don't think Fodic is the kind of consistent carry for them to be able to win a lot of games in that way. Invincible is someone who I actually do like. I know a lot of people are sitting there going, put Rich in, put Rich in, put Rich in. I've talked about this on the channel before. I will say it again here. I actually think Rich is a really, I'm not going to say really, but a relatively bad idea for this team because what Rich doesn't offer is a way to win the game. Rich offers consistency. Rich offers you a stable presence in the top side. He's not going to be very good in lane, but he's going to be really consistent in team fights. He's basically Wonder, just over here in the LPL, but like, this team doesn't need that. This team has enough players that aren't going to win you the game. This team needs someone who can generate a lead early and snowball out of control. That is what Invincible offers at his best. He tried his best in game 1. His game 2 wasn't very good. Xiaoxu was just kind of better than him on the Cassante, but I still think Invincible gives you a little bit more upside, and I do understand why they're going with him just for, you know, I guess playstyle reasons, but something has to give for NIP, and I just don't know what that is right now. As for LGD, they're going to be really happy to secure their second win of the year. This doesn't really make me think like, oh, maybe they're actually a lot better than we think they are. They lost to Ultra Prime earlier in the week, so it's not like I'm completely changing my mind on how this team plays. It's just a good sign. I think Haiqiao is actually a pretty decent player, someone who I think could grow into a relatively okay mid laner at this level. Still not sold about the rest of the roster, but I mean, considering the situation they're in as a team, you got to be happy with winning a series no matter how it happened. That brings us to our second series of day 5 here in the LPL, and it was definitely one that I was looking forward to watching because I do think both of these teams are relatively similar in terms of skill level. We saw ThunderTalk Gaming taking on OMG, and OMG is able to take the series 2-0. I feel very, very good about this. I think a lot of people would consider this a little bit of an upset because a lot of people have ThunderTalk rated really highly, but I planted my flag in OMG at the beginning of the year. This is a feel-good moment for us on the channel, so I'm, you know, kind of happy to see it. I do like ThunderTalk as a team, but I really, really like OMG, and I feel like they finally got a chance to show off a bit of their, I guess, merit in this series here. Obviously, some mistakes coming over on the side of ThunderTalk that kind of led to it being a little bit easier for OMG to win, but they still had to perform. Game number 1 was definitely just a straight OMG win. It was relatively close, but they were able to play the team fights a lot better. Abel's Tristana is so much fun. I know he gets a lot of credit for the Samira, rightfully so. It's a permaban against OMG for a reason, but the Tristana is also a pick that is very synonymous with Abel as a player. When he's able to get that, he looks fantastic, and we'll talk about Abel. He's my player of the series for OMG. He continues to look awesome. And then in game 2, you've got the Triple Marksman Cup. You've got Tristana, Kai'Sa, Varus coming out as a trio. We are getting dangerously close to a 10 marksman game. I mean, sure. On the other side, we had Ashe. I'm sure we could have had Ashe support something like Azeri or whatever, right? Ezreal, whatever you want to play there. We could get there. I think it could be pretty funny, but for now, Abel looking really good in the matchups that he is handed. Obviously, we'll talk about how bad ThunderTalk's draft is in game number 2 in a second because I hate this, and I'll talk about why, but Abel looked fantastic. I think Abel isn't the one of the major prospects that I am the most excited about moving forward in the future. Shanji and Cream are obviously 2 players that I'm super high on, but Abel deserves to at least be spoken in that conversation just as well. His mechanics when he's able to get ahead are phenomenal. He's a great team fighter. He can be a solid laner. I think playing an entire year with PP God in support is going to make him better because PP God has basically made every AD carry that he's played with better with the exception of that 1 year on BLG where just everything went wrong for that entire team, but really like Abel. Thought he had a great series. PP God did a really good job, especially in that game 2 on the Varus to kind of keep up. But also, you got to give a ton of credit to Cream, because the Tristana was also a big factor in game 2, just coming out of the mid lane. And this is where ThunderTalk's draft really strikes them, because blind pick Kassadin, that's just, it's super bold. You're able to pick something like the Tristana. I guess TT just assumed they wouldn't go AD mid, because they already have Kai'Sa, Varus in the bot lane, and then Wukong in the jungle. But blind picking the Kassadin, getting the Tristana as the counter pick just meant that that lane was over immediately, and Cream was able to do so much in that mid lane. Was able to take over the lane, was able to translate that into a lot of advantages for OMG just in general. Shanji had a really good series on the Cassante as well, not particularly good for Hoya, which we'll get into, but overall, it just felt like OMG felt really cohesive here. The bot lane was definitely the standout, but the solo laners also looking pretty good. As for ThunderTalk, some good moments and some bad moments. Game 1 was relatively close. You had chances to win that. I thought Yucao was playing okay on the rise. Certainly was in a situation to be able to do some stuff. I thought Huanfeng and Yao Yao, while they weren't able to win lane, they were fine, generally speaking. It was the top side that definitely let them down in game number 1. Hoya was atrocious on the Scion, basically accomplishing nothing. If you're a tank and you can't tank, you can't really do anything. Beishuan with some poor engages on the Wukong. Overall, ThunderTalk just kind of struggled there. And then game 2 was a complete slaughter. In my opinion, a lot due to draft. Shanji, playing Cassante and Anar is pretty easy for the Cassante. And then I already said it, Kassadin into Tristana. If you're going to target that mid lane as the team with the Tristana, the game is just over. Kassadin's never going to get online. You don't have nearly enough damage in this comp to supplement Kassadin damage if you never get there. And so, you're just going to lose in 23 minutes, which is exactly what happened to ThunderTalk here. I still think that they're a fine team. Hoya's going to get my dud of the series. He was really the player that stood out as being, destroyed in both games, where I think, obviously, Yucao didn't have a very good game 2, but he was very important in game 1, and I thought Beishuan wasn't particularly good, but I don't know how much it was his fault. Yes, he lost jungle pressure early, but all of his lanes were losing, especially in that game 2, so I don't want to punish him too hard. I just want to say that Hoya was not particularly good. I was kind of gassing him up and this team up earlier on in the week. This was a less than stellar performance, especially compared to what they had earlier on. I don't think it's the worst loss in the world for ThunderTalk. I think OMG is a good team, if a little bit of a streaky team. I just think that, ThunderTalk is maybe a little bit closer to where I'm projecting them rather than where I think a lot of other people are projecting them. Can they make top 10? Absolutely. Are they top 10 right now? Maybe. I don't know, but I don't know if they're top 7 or 8, like I think a lot of other analysts were starting to talk about after they started going on their little win streak. I still think they're a good team. They still have the major question marks, though. Top side is definitely a question mark. I want to see Huanfeng, really pop off and, win a game. I know he's had that a couple of times this year, but it's not been nearly as consistent. I think ThunderTalk will rebound. I just think it was a little bit of a rough day for them here. As for OMG, exactly what you want to see. You want to see these players stepping up, the young players in particular, the carry players, Shanji, Kareem, Abel. Those are the 3 that you want to see performing well, because if those 3 perform well consistently, this team is going to be scary. They're not going to be a top 4 or 5 team. I really don't think they have that kind of upside, but this is a team that should be in the playoff mix. I've gotten a little bit of flack in the past few weeks for consistently putting them into the top 10, but I think this is the kind of series that kind of proves why I want to do that. I think when their back is against the wall, they should be able to beat a lot of these teams that are right on the outskirts in that mid-tier. Really like what OMG's putting together. Even if they're not a top tier team, they should be a very fun one to watch just for the rest of the year. Now we're jumping into our super days here in the LPL Week 6. If my voice gets even worse from here on out, I apologize. I'm really trying to get this video out on time, but we got to get through these last 2 days here. And we kicked off the first Super Day here on Saturday with a matchup between Invictus Gaming and JD Gaming, a battle between 2 teams that I don't think a lot of people expected to be nearly as close in the standings as they are right now. 5-2, 4-2. IG actually has a better record, but JDG does get the job done here, and they are able to pick up the series in 2 games. This isn't particularly surprising. They absolutely should be the better team, but obviously they struggled a bit earlier on in the week. So did IG, but it's just good to see a team like JDG bounce back, be able to kind of get their footing, and then honestly even face some adversity in terms of how Invictus wants to throw some strategies at them. We'll jump right into that in game 2. IG actually goes for the lane swap very early on into the game. They send On and Wink up to top side to face 369, and then Yushinomi goes bot to try and stabilize as much as he can against Ruler and Missing. Both bot lanes do get pretty far ahead from this. We'll talk about it in a bit. Ruler does get a really strong advantage because Yushinomi does not play safe on the Scion. And 369 is killed in the top lane as well to give On gold, but unfortunately they go essentially immediately back to regular lanes, and Ruler and Missing just win from that point onwards, and so JDG is just given a huge lead, and then game 1 was a little bit more standard. They were kind of just the better team. For JDG, they just looked really solid. Ruler is going to get my player of the series, although a couple really good options here. I think Ruler obviously deserves it, but I would be remiss to not shout out Missing, who was really, really good, especially in this game number 2. I think he didn't miss a single Ash arrow the entire game, maybe the entire series. He was just taking over the map. I think it's really, really fun to watch a really good player play Ash support, because just the amount of pressure that you can have globally on the map generally all throughout the game is pretty intense, and to complement that with maybe the best team fighting and skirmish heavy AD carry in the entire world in Ruler, it's just a recipe. It's absolutely a recipe for success, and that bot lane did a really good job of being able to generate consistent leads. Credit to Knight, he was still pretty good. Credit to Kanavi, I thought he was fantastic. 2 games of Gragas in the jungle. We're not really seeing Gragas go jungle much anymore, but obviously Kanavi's played a shit ton of this champion over the past, 4 or 5 years. Flexing it into the jungle is a relatively decent idea. He actually did a really good job going into Gideon in the series, generally consistently had lane pressure, which is very good, considering he had a really bad start to the week, if we're being entirely honest. And then 369 certainly had his hiccups, but for the most part was solid. Overall, I would say JDG looked like they should in this series. They looked like the world beaters that they were in the first couple weeks of the LPL. Obviously, they had started to run into some trouble, but it's good to know that they can bounce back even against a team that is performing relatively well like Invictus. But over on the IG side, you know, some interesting drafts, some interesting gameplay, but just not really able to make it work. Not a particularly great series for them. I think they just kind of got outclassed in game 1 and then obviously made some major mistakes in a very bold call in game number 2. I do think that lane swap is possible. I don't think it's very good right now, especially when you quite frankly have a top laner that does not know how to play safe and will try to initiate a 1v3 and just give gold over to the enemy bot laner. You Should Know Me is going to get my dud of the series here. He's really had some problems not being a target for teams after the breakout start to the year that he has had. I think teams have realized that he is really good at playing from ahead, and he's really good at being able to generate 1v1s, but he's also going to be super overextended a lot of the time and really punishable in that regard. Very similar to the Shy in that kind of circumstance, where when he wins hard. When he loses hard, and he lost hard in this series. If he would have played just a tad bit more safe on the Scion early, maybe you get some free gold on your bot lane and switch it back, and then maybe it's a little bit of a different story, but Ruler being able to be accelerated as much as he was in game number 2 was a big problem for Invictus. So You Should Know Me. You know, the nomer that we're seeing on Reddit now is You Should Kill Me when he has some bad games, because teams tend to camp him when he's not playing particularly well. He doesn't know how to play safe. Certainly wasn't the only player on IG to not play well. On and Wink were really bad this series. They were awful in game number 1, getting obliterated there. And then while they did have some good moments in game number 2, they just weren't able to translate it into anything. Dove was terrible. Pulled out the Renekton mid. Not really working. Gideon didn't have a pretty good series. Honestly, Invictus just looked completely and utterly outclassed, which on paper is what should happen here. Like, I know we're super high on Invictus, but it seems they are crashing down to earth a tad bit here, which is something I expected. I still think they're a solid team, but, you know, the top 4 hype, I think, is disapparating just a tad bit as the weeks and the months go on. I think they have a lot of talent. On and Wink have played well, not in this series, but they have played well up till this point in this year, and You Should Know Me can win a lot of games for them, but I think going up against some of the better teams, maybe some of their weaknesses get exploited just a tad bit more. And then for JDG, really happy to see them come out and just kind of shellac a team, and a good team at that in Invictus. That's really what I wanted to see. I wanted to see them get back to this point where they just are outskilling the enemy team. They do still have some problems in terms of being able to adapt and being able to play from an even state in the mid game, but with how talented all these players are at the early game, a lot of times they're just not going to have to do that, and that's a good sign. You know, obviously you want to see them get tested, but it's also good to see that they still know how to dominate games, and I definitely think that if I'm trying to encapsulate the series in one little bow, that's what I would say is what happened, is they dominated this series. Moving on to our second game here of day number 6. We had an interesting matchup between Rare Adam and Bilibili Gaming, and BLG picks up the win. This is what should happen here. RA was able to take a game in the series, and honestly, there were a couple players in this series that played really well on the side of Rare Adam. But BLG did their job. They were able to take them down, and they're able to show that they still have a lot of fight left in them. Obviously, they had a really good series earlier in the week against some poor competition in Anyone's Legend, but a much tougher opponent here in RA, a team that is actually competent and actually is trying to win the game. And some of the players that BLG needed to step up absolutely did step up. Most notably, Yagao in the mid lane, who has been this team's weakest player, I would say, over the course of the year so far. I think they've relied a lot on Elk in the bot lane to win them a lot of their series, but Yagao stepping up, being able to take a lot of those resources, being able to facilitate some progress in the game, that's what made JDG so scary last year as a team. Yes, they had a lot of talent surrounding him. Yes, Kanavi's really good. Yes, 369's really good, but Yagao being able to make sure that those players are constantly and efficiently in a position to be able to carry those games is what made JDG one of the best teams in the world and the best team in the LPL. Yagao very much can do that for this roster as well, and I think this was a really good step in that direction. A pretty easy choice for player of the series. He has been very much a disappointment, I would say, over the beginning part of the year, but that Jace game in Game 1 really set the tone, I would say, for the rest of the series. Wasn't perfect in Game 2, but bounces back with Syndra in Game 3, and he looks really good doing it. It's a bunch of different champions, and different types of champions than what he was playing a lot of last year. Obviously, you think of the Talia, you think of the Ahri, for what he was bringing out a lot in 2022. That's not really what we got here in this series, but it still worked nonetheless. Some more aggressive picks here coming out for him, and they definitely worked out. Hopefully, this is the kind of form that he can carry into a lot of the rest of the year, because I do think that Jun and Yagao can be a really strong jungle mid duo. I just don't know. Clearly, they have not been that over the beginning part of the year. That's been the weakness for BLG, and hopefully this is the sign and the start of potentially a much more cohesive run from this jungle mid duo that played well in this series. The other player I have to shout out is going to be Bin in the top lane, who looked really solid. He was just better than Cube. No flame to Cube. Bin's a really good player, but Bin and Yagao really stepped up. I thought those were the two players that definitely showed up and showed out for BLG. Pretty much everyone else, though, was kind of meh. I thought Elk and On were kind of meh. I wanted to see more out of them, especially more damage coming out of Elk. And then, I'm going to be honest, Jun was the worst jungler in this series, and it really wasn't all that close. That's a nice transition, I would say, over to Rare Adam now, where we got to talk about Leon, who was phenomenal in this series. Really, he almost single-handedly won the series for Rare Adam. He kept every single game close. He did a really good job on the Wukong, on the Sedge, whoever he was playing at the time. Strive was kind of the main man that he was playing with. And those two have really developed a nice chemistry. I've already talked about how good I think Strive has gotten in the league this year in 2023. I think Leon has done a really good job of being able to play off of that. This was Leon's best series of the year. I know they were 4-2 leading into this, but this was the series that impressed me the most. He was going up against a good jungler in Jun, albeit someone who has struggled recently, and he looked really, really good. If he can play like this over a more sustainable period of time with the early games especially, then RA is going to be a playoff team. Unfortunately, they weren't able to get it done today against a very determined BLG team, but it's definitely not to the fault of Leon, and it's definitely not to the fault of Strive. My dud of the series was a little bit difficult to give, but I am going to give it to Southwind. I do think you could give it to Awesome, who was doing basically nothing in the final 2 games of the series. I think you could give it to Cube, who looked relatively outmatched by Bin, but overall, it felt like Southwind had the least amount of impact on the series, and this bot lane in general has just been pretty disappointing for RA. In my opinion, they are the weak link of the team right now. I know a lot of people are excited about Awesome. You know, I know a lot of people aren't excited about Southwind. I'm not blaming it entirely on Awesome, but both of these players have to be better. Like, if Awesome was as good as a lot of people said he was, he would be able to at least do something towards the back half of a lot of these games that are given time to teamfight. He's just not able to do that. He is an okay AD carry that I think a lot of people are just kind of waiting to break out into being a really good AD carry. I'm not sure he's going to hit that this year. He certainly hasn't shown flashes of that yet, but overall for RA, this was a relatively speaking good showing. I mean, they are a good team going up against a relatively good team. I think, honestly, this gives me more confidence in Rare Adam than what I had earlier on in the week, because they really did go toe-to-toe with BLG, and they looked really solid doing it, especially that jungle mid duo. And then for BLG, this is definitely a sigh of relief coming out here with Yagao playing as well as he did. If he can step up and actually be the player that we think he can be, they can be a top 4 team. On paper, they should be a top 4 team, but so far that jungle mid duo has not worked. If Jun can step up and actually be efficient in the jungle, which I don't think he really has been this year so far, BLG can legitimately be scary and be a strong team, because Bin is great, Elk has been great. You get Jun and Yagao to step up, that's going to be strong. Just, I still have some major question marks about it all coming together, but at least for now, they're at the very least a competitive team that's going to be able to kind of separate themselves from the mid-tier. It's just about whether or not they can actually reach higher than that as we go on further in the split. Moving on now to our final series here of day number 6, and it went just about as I think a lot of us would have expected, luckily. We had Ultra Prime taking on Weibo Gaming, and Weibo picks up the 2-0 series win. Definitely not always in the bag for a team like Weibo to be able to dispatch some of the worst teams in the league, but they did it this time, and congrats to them. Sometimes they just don't. We saw that earlier in the week. They kind of get a little bit of their groove back. A lot of the players that really struggled in that series looked a lot better here, but let's go ahead and go over it. Starting off with my player of the series, which pretty easily goes to Xiaohu in the mid lane. The King of Spring is back, and he looks really, really good. I haven't really said his name all that much at the beginning of the year, because it really feels like the Shy and Karsa are the big names right now on Weibo. People arguing whether Karsa should be in the LPL at all or not, and then the Shy himself arguing whether or not he should be in the LPL at all with some of the games that he is playing, but overall, I still feel like the bottom side of this map is really, really good and has been relatively consistent. Xiaohu's had some bad games. Light hasn't, which we'll talk about in a second, but Xiaohu looked really good in this series. A really good Kassadin game in Game 1, but an exceptionally good Talia game in Game 2. That was a champion he found a ton of success on in 2022, a year that I think was honestly incredibly underrated for Xiaohu as a whole. I'm really hoping to see him continue to grow and be a focal point for Weibo. I think he's really, really good for this team as a whole. I think he's very similar to Light in the sense of the reason I rank both of them so high in terms of my player rankings is because I do feel like they can play any kind of style that you need them to. Last year, we saw Xiaohu kind of be a primary carry for RNG a lot of the year before they started going to Gala a bit more as we got into the playoffs, but we know that he can be very good at these more shove and roam support style mids, things like the Talia, things like the Silas, that have been really popular over the course of the past year. He played a lot of that in the regular season as well. And then Light is very similar. He can be strong side, he can be weak side. He's just so incredibly consistent. He can be your hyper carry like he was for LNG for a lot of 2022, but he can also be a really important weak side player like he's been for Weibo so far this year. I think those two are really the big reason why I feel so much confidence in saying that Weibo is probably going to be fine, basically no matter what happens on the top side. Now, that's not going to apply to every single series, because the Shy and Karsa, truthfully, can lose any game together as a duo, and Crisp has had some moments where he's been really good as well, but I really think that Xiaohu and Light, big standouts in this series in particular, and probably the two big standouts of Weibo in general in terms of consistency. I'm really glad to see Light's finally starting to get some of the recognition he deserves. I've actually seen his name being thrown around as one of the best AD carries in the world. I was making that argument for a lot of 2022 on LNG, where it really felt like he was doing his absolute best to drag that team to Worlds, and he got very close. He got one series away. And it's really good to see him maybe on a more high-profile team, a team that has more expectations, a team that is, quite frankly, better around him, getting that recognition, I think, this year. Hopefully he's able to keep that up, but those are the two players that you really have to shout out because they played well. The Shy was so much better in this series than he was at any point during their first series this week. Karsa was fine, Crisp was good. Overall, Weibo just looked very cohesive, and that is a good sign. As for Ultra Prime on the other side, I mean, they got destroyed by Weibo. They should get destroyed by Weibo. There were some positives in this series. I think Ning is actually okay in terms of early game. Karsa's not necessarily the king of early game. I think Karsa definitely benefits more from having a really strong mid to late game comp around him. That's why picks like the Sejuani make a lot of sense for this team as a whole. But Ning doing a really good job of being able to, give his team an opportunity to play the game, most notably the Lucian and the Yuumi in the bot lane there. But overall, just not enough. The solo laners were really garbage for Ultra Prime in this series. Ching is going to get my dud of the series again. He was dud of the week last week. He was okay earlier on this week, but reverting back to his original form now that he's playing a better team. And then Harry was nothing in the top lane, got completely destroyed by the Shy. I believe he was solo killed in the series. Just, the solo laners are a problem for Ultra Prime. That is not new information. It's just carrying over here. I still think Doggo and Baolan are okay in the bot lane. Certainly not a great bot lane, but not a major problem either. They've definitely been the best part of this Ultra Prime team, and I do think that carried over a bit into the series. They just, obviously, the rest of the team lost as well, so them losing was a little bit of a problem. But overall for Ultra Prime, even with the win earlier on in the week, I think that we had a pretty good read on them. They're about the 14th, 15th best team in the LPL. I think top 13 feels super locked right now. They are all teams that I think that genuinely can compete for a playoff spot. Ultra Prime does not feel like they're in that conversation for me. They have talent. I like Doggo. Ning's looked okay. Baolan's looked okay, but the solo laners are really, really bad, and overall it just doesn't feel like they work as a unit, especially this mid-jungle duo, and so I don't really have a ton of hope for Ultra Prime, but not the worst week in the world for them. And then for Weibo, obviously, walking out of this week 1-1 is not particularly what you wanted. Maybe a 2-0 would have been a lot better. But at the end of the day, at least you won a series. You had a nice bounce back. You destroyed Ultra Prime, which you absolutely needed to do. If you lost the series as well, that would have been absolutely tragic. But good for you. You looked good. Xiaohu and Light continue to be kind of the anchors for this team. When the Shy and Karsa step up as well, this team genuinely looks unbeatable. They really are that talented. It's just always going to be about the consistency when it comes to Weibo. Now we get to jump into our final day of LPL action here in Week 5, and we kicked off our final day with an interesting matchup between LNG Esports and FunPlus Phoenix. That LNG does take 2-0, but it's certainly not the cleanest 2-0 of all time. LNG, like I said earlier, should be able to dispatch a lot of these teams that are lower in the power rankings, lower in the standings than a lot of other teams, but they did have a little bit of trouble with FPX, who did make a couple of lineup adjustments. Obviously, talked about Fearness coming in at the beginning of the week earlier on in their first series, but they actually bring in Chocho to play support as well. We've been talking about how Lele has not been particularly good for FPX. Him and LWX just didn't seem to really have any synergy at all. So you bring in Chocho, someone who has a ridiculous amount of experience at this level, obviously long-time support here in the LPL, and so you're hoping that just gives you a bit more stability as a duo, and I would argue that so far, it's worked. They really haven't had a lot of time to mesh together, but this series was actually really good, I would say, from the FPX bot lane. LWX looked better than he had all year long, in my opinion, but you also are just kind of flip-flopping in the top lane. You got Fairness in there. You bring Xiaolahu back in for game number 2. Xiaolahu definitely looks like the better player, but it'll be interesting to see where they go from there. LNG just takes advantage of a lot of these miscommunications, a lot of this new synergy coming out from FPX, and it just kind of outskills them in a lot of ways. Really good series from Scout, who's going to get the player of the series. He's just one of the best mids in the world still. still he has been for such a long time. I know I'm a little bit lower on Scout in the sense of I don't think he's like Chovy, you know what I mean? I don't think that he can just win any game if he puts his mind to it. I don't think that that's really, you know, he's not Knight, in my opinion, in the LPL. He's a really good player, but maybe not someone who's like top 5 in the world. But, you know, top 20 player in the world isn't bad, you know what I mean? Potentially like top 15, somewhere in that range, right? Scout's a really, really good player. He seems to have really good synergy with Tarzan, who also had a really good series and generally just had a fantastic week. Those two are the lifeblood of LNG, and they are the reason this team is sitting here at 6-1 in the standings after 5 weeks. That is a ridiculously good record. Yes, they've played a lot of the bad teams early on in the year, and that's something that we will talk about when we get to the power rankings and why they're not like top 3, top 2, you know, as a maybe the best record in the league. But still, you have to respect the fact that this team is incredibly consistent at being able to generate their own leads. So credit to Scout, credit to Tarzan. They're the two players that I really want to shout out. LP and Hang had some problems. Hang in particular, he was good in game number 1. He was bad in game number 2 on the Leona, on the Engager there. Hopefully that's just a little, you know, nerves problem. You know, maybe the Engagers aren't exactly all that good right now, so who knows what that was, but, you know, a little bit of a rough series from LP and Hang, but Tarzan and Scout were definitely there to pick up the slack. As for FPX on the other side, like I said, some really good showings here. Game number 1 was interesting in the early part, but they just threw that away very quickly. And then game number 2, LWX and Chocho were actually making it very interesting towards the back half of that Caitlyn and Lux. Caitlyn can do a lot of damage if you do have peel for her, and this team does have peel. Unfortunately, they're just worse in team fights. Like, the players are just worse. Kare had a bad series. He had a bad week, if I'm being entirely honest, and just got outplayed by Scout, which is frustrating because he should be the best player on this team. And then dud of the series for me is going to go to Hacker in the jungle. Not a very good Elise game coming out from him. You need to make a lot of those plays early, or else the Lilia in particular is just going to punish you very, very hard towards the back half of the game. And that's what happened for FPX. Not really a lot of room to maneuver when it's literally just LWX for damage, and you have to go into this entire LNG comp of Jace Shockwaves, of Lilia, of Camille, of Varus. Like, there's just so many ways to fully go in when you're LNG on a comp that really is relying on that Caitlyn, especially with how things played out. So overall, FPX not looking awful. They looked much better, in my opinion, in this series than they did at any point in their first series this week, but I do need to point out that they still are a middling team, right? Like, just because they looked good against LNG doesn't mean that they were great, right? Like, if you're good enough to win a game, you should win a game, and they weren't able to win any games. So hopefully bringing in a couple of new faces into this roster, figuring out who you want in top lane, bringing Chocho into support can solidify a bit more consistency for the team. But right now, I still feel a lot of problems with this roster exist. And then for LNG, you're good. I don't know how good just yet. This is a team that could potentially be like a top 3, 4 team in the league, could potentially be a top 7 or 8 team in the league. They are somewhere within that range. It's going to get a lot more tested when they start going up against some actually tough competition and not FunPlus Phoenix. But for now, you know, good synergy, okay play. Hopefully Scout and Tarzan can continue that, because if they can, I imagine this team is still going to be in the top. But a lot of pressure is going to start being placed on that bot lane and that top lane, who really have a lot to prove. So LG is going to be a very interesting team to watch over the next few weeks, and I think a lot of that stems from how they've played in the series. Moving on now to our second series here of day number 7, and it was a very, very wild one as we saw Anyone's Legend taking on Team WE, and AL picks up their first win of the entire year here in this series. WE's collapse this week has been definitely something to watch. 2 series where they looked completely incompetent. One against an actually good team in LNG, another against a really bad team in Anyone's Legend, and so let's go ahead and talk about it. Starting on the AL side, of course, player of the series was actually kind of difficult. I feel like this was more of a team effort for AL than it was one particular player standing out and just being significantly better, but I'm going to give it to Pins in the mid lane, who I actually really liked this series. I thought the Galio game in Game 1 was phenomenal. He was everywhere on the map, protecting basically everybody he needed to. And people forget, like, Galio can really do some damage, and Pins was really able to contribute a lot there. And then the Rise game in Game 3, really influential, was just much better than Shanks towards the back half of the game, even if Shanks did a good job, you know, maintaining pressure in the early to mid part. I think Shanks was good. We'll get to that in a bit, but Pins was honestly just better. I really like Pins as a player. I've talked about him a lot when it came to the LDL. He was one of the players I was most impressed by when I got to watching LDL tape going into the year. Pins and Leave were definitely the 2 players that stood out to me. I think a lot of other people had a few other names thrown in there, but those were the 2 where I really felt super good about them, like, coming in and just being strong. And, you know, obviously it hasn't really worked out, like, in a full-time capacity. He hasn't been particularly good all year long, but this is a flash, and that's all I really need to see to start believing again, is flashes that you can go into an LPL caliber team and actually perform at a relatively decent level, and that's what Pin showed here. Betty and Sword Art were also relatively good here. Sword Art in particular was phenomenal in game number 3. Betty did a really good job on the Kai'Sa as well, but I want to give a shout out to Sword Art's Ashe, which was really impactful. Those ultimates are huge. Obviously, being able to generate a huge pressure lead in game number 1 was massive, being able to make sure that Betty got online towards the back half of the game. Going into Varus, Caitlyn as Zeri, Yuumi is not particularly easy, and for them to be able to win that lane, let alone be able to translate it into some late game pressure, is impressive stuff. So I would say the bottom 3, probably the most impressive members of AL in this series win, which is shocking because it's the top side that I think has been the best in their losses. Obviously, everybody knows how I feel about Xiao Hao at this point. He's super trapped on this team. He was okay in this series. I actually think it was one of his weaker series of the year, which is weird enough to say, but he was really in the money for, or in the market of making his teammates look better, which is a good thing. It's definitely a part of the game that he has. He can carry, but he can also enable. And then ZDZ was good. I felt like he was awesome in game number 1 on the Camille. Slowly got worse as he got some more boring matchups down the line in the series, but overall, this is easily AL's best series of the year so far, and it's not even particularly close. As for WE, disaster strikes. I mean, this 0-2 week just got so much worse because it's to AL, which is probably the worst team in the league to lose to, if I'm being entirely honest. 0-7, you know, you're a team that actually wants to compete for playoffs. This is bad, and I think it's a lot of the players really starting, I don't want to say to come back down to earth, but, you know, maybe starting to get tested a tad bit more than they were at the beginning of the year. Obviously, the main one that you have to point to here is Hang, who has been really bad, I would say, in the past week or so. Obviously, was garbage against LNG. Tarzan obliterated him in that series, but he wasn't particularly good in week 4 either. Obviously, we've talked about him, really good early game jungler that is now not having good early games, so what does that mean? That means he's not very good, and that's kind of really where we've started getting to. I'm not really sure what the quick fix for that is. He was having much better early game pathings. He was able to generate a lot of leads on these more aggressive champions early, maybe going to a more aggressive style jungle pick and then something more passive in the mid lane could be good, but the problem with that is that Shanks is your big carry. Shanks is easily the best player on this team, and he performed like it in this series. He won game 2 basically by himself. Big credit to Biu. I actually thought he was okay there on the Cassante as well in a lot of those late game team fights, but major problems in game number 3 for Shanks when he backs right before a dragon fight, and then WE takes it anyways 4v5 and loses the game off of it. Some really bad shot calling. Hope and Awandi were garbage, like I said. Losing Varus, Caitlyn into Zeri, Yuumi is pretty inexcusable, but just getting saddled on Jhin duty for 2 straight games and doing 0 damage isn't exactly the answer that you're looking for. They lost lane in all 3 games, even in the game that WE won, and so not a lot of positives to take away, I would say, from WE here. This is probably their worst showing of the year by a large margin. At least Shanks is kind of good, and Biu has shown, like, relative proficiency on meatballs, like Cassante, but put him on anything that actually requires you to play the game, something like Jax, he's just going to crumble and fall. I don't actually think this WE team is all that good, and I'm very concerned with how they played this week. This feels more like a panic sign than it does like just a blip on the radar, and so I'll be keeping my eye on WE, but they're definitely going to suffer in the power rankings for this. And then for AL, great win. You really needed this. Being the last team in the LPL, almost said LEC, being the last team in the LPL to win a game is tough. It's tragic, but at least you did it. You're not WE from last year who didn't do it, didn't win a single series in summer. So good for AL. They're able to get that first win on the board. I don't know if it's going to lead into anything more. This team still has some major question marks, but at the very least, you were able to go 1-7 through the first 5 weeks of the season, and that's got to at least be better than 0-8. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, our final series of day number 7. These LPL videos are gruesome to do, especially when you have a throat that wants to give out on you every 2 minutes. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me through this. I know my voice may not sound perfect, but I appreciate you guys enjoying the video if you are. But let's go ahead and jump into this final series, which is a top-of-the-table clash between Edward Gaming and Top Esports, 2 teams that I'm really excited to see face off against each other. Top Esports coming out on top here, but a very narrow series, very back and forth, and both teams honestly coming out of it looking very good and showing a lot of promise. Let's go ahead and talk about it, of course, starting on the side of Top Esports. Basically, everybody on the team for Top really performed here. Player of the series is kind of hard. Could be Jackie Love, that positioning, especially in Game 3 on the Varus. How does he not die at that Baron fight? Perfectly timed stopwatch. They invest everything in him, and they can't kill him. You could give it to Ching Tian, who's awesome on the Cassante. Legitimately a huge upgrade to what Wayward was offering you last year. A legitimately good top laner. You could give it to Tian, who just has JJ's number. I mean, the dude just wins over JJ every time when he's like 12, 13, and 1 against him. It's actually absurd. But I'm going to give it to Rookie, because it's Rookie and he had this kind of series. It's just kind of, it's different when you play against him. The amount of pressure that he's able to exert on the map, while not only being down in resources, but in being up in resources, willing to give over resources, taking resources. He's just the perfect mid laner. Like, there's really not a lot that you could ask Rookie to do that he just wouldn't do, and he wouldn't do it at the highest possible level. So for me, Rookie's going to be getting player of the series. He dominated the mid lane matchup early on here, especially in game 3 as the Jace. Fofo had some really good engages towards the back half of that game, but just didn't really matter. Rookie was in his zone and he was able to win the games out. But like I said earlier, credit to Jackie Love. He was awesome, especially in that game number 3. I think Rookie and Jackie Love are the two I was definitely considering. But Ching Tian, even Mark, all deserve at least an honorable mention. Top Esports just felt like a great cohesive unit. They're awesome. They're really, really fun to watch, and they take care of business against some of the best teams in the league. There is a lot to like about Top Esports, and honestly, it's hard not to cheer and root for this team. But on the side of EDG, you really don't have a lot to be hateful about. Yes, you lost the series, but it was very close, and honestly, your players did show up and play well. Fofo has been awesome for this team. There were some phenomenal engages from him on the Azir in that game number 3. Could have been a huge problem for EDG in a lot of these circumstances, but his engages were super impactful. Maybe the last one wasn't perfect. Maybe if he had just stayed in the back and actually done his damage, EDG maybe has a better time winning that fight, but at the end of the day, at least he's going for these plays. At least he's trying to win, and he's been really positive, I would say, over the course of the year so far. Leave had some mistakes. I'm not going to pretend like he was perfect in this series. A little bit of a bot gap, especially in Game 3. But, especially compared to expectations, he actually held up to Jackie Love, I would say, relatively well. He was being gifted a lot of gold, and he actually did a lot of damage with it in a lot of the end of these games. So, even though, 14 deaths is a lot, his impact on the game was certainly there. I think Ale was strong. I think Mako was strong. Unfortunately, I have to give dud to the series, and that for me is going to go to JJ, who just didn't really seem to have it this series. Like I said earlier, Tian just seems to have his number. He seems to know how to play into him as a player, and JJ didn't really have a response to that, so he's going to get dud of the series. Wasn't a particularly awful series from him, but some bad engages on the Wukong in game number 1 definitely stand out, and then not really just being all that useful on the Sejuani in game number 3. Those are kind of the things that stand out overall, but EDG is still a really good team, and they proved here why they deserve, really, to be in the top 4. I know it's a loss, but this was a very, very good loss, and it honestly gave me more confidence in EDG because they went toe-to-toe with a team like Top Esports, who is legit, and they looked great doing it. So I think both of these teams looking really, really strong here. EDG even in loss, Top Esports especially in win. Both of them are legit contenders to win the LPL in Spring Split of this year, and maybe we'll be getting another matchup between these two as we get a lot closer to playoff time. All right, that is going to do it for my LPL Week 5 overview and analysis. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LPL standings after 5 weeks of games. Of course, you're going to see any ties be broken in the standings alphabetically. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, how those have changed from last week to this week. So let's go over biggest risers, biggest fallers. Not really a lot of changes this week. I feel like everything went a little bit to chalk, but we just got a little bit more info. Some teams dropped, some teams rose. I'll talk about the leapfroggers here first. ThunderTalk and Rare Adam jumping up 2 spots each to 10 and 11, leapfrogging WE and Ninjas and Pyjamas, who fall to 12 and 13. They are clearly just better than these two teams are right now. I still think the cluster is kind of there, but they are just better. And then the other leapfrog here, Royal Never Give Up, RNG jumping to number 7 after a good week, and unfortunately, Invictus falling down to number 8. They're still a good team, but the 0-2 week didn't exactly leave me with the most confidence, even if it was against good teams. I don't want to drop them any further than 8, because I still think they are good, but RNG definitely deserves to start moving up as they develop a little bit more consistency. But those are really the only changes. Not a lot of adjustments in the power rankings this week. It feels like I was kind of spot on with how I felt about a lot of these teams. But let's go ahead and move into my player of the week and my dud of the week. My player of the week is going to go to Scout on LNG. I thought he was really fantastic this week. LNG in general just looked really, really good. Sitting at 6-1, they have the best record in the LPL, which is insane. I still don't have them in my top 4 in terms of, where I have them in the power rankings. I think top 4 feels very solidified right now, but LNG is going to have some games coming up against some of these better teams. They're going to have the opportunity to prove that they deserve to belong in the top 3, top 4, and I'm really excited to see what they can do there. Scout is a big part of that. Tarzan as well, but Scout is a big part of that, and that's why he's going to get my player of the week. My dud of the week, though, for week number 5, no surprise to a lot of people, is going to go to Hang on Team WE. I mean, WE had a disaster of a week, but Hang in particular just looked like he could not play League of Legends at this level. An early game jungler that was failing to get early game leads in every single game that he played. It's not a very good look, and he was a big reason why WE struggled. Not the only reason. Hope and Awandi were also not very good, but for WE, they're really going to need to rely on that jungler in order to propel them into a spot where they can compete, and he just was not able to do that this week, and that's why they fall in the power rankings. That's why Hang is my dud of the week here in week 5, and Scout is my player of the week in week 5, but that's going to do it. I really do hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know it's a little bit less in terms of the energy, in terms of the, the talk, the excited talking, but I still hope the analysis was good for you guys. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot. It's about 4 a.m. As I'm finishing recording this video because I really want to make sure this gets out on time, and I had to take a lot of breaks for the throat to catch up. So if you enjoyed it, it really would mean a lot if you left a like, especially on this one. Let me know down in the comment section below, who am I too high on, who am I too low on? You guys know I love to hear you guys' feedback. And then, of course, if you're new here, hit subscribe. Not only do I do LPL content, all 4 major regions and the NACL, you know the jazz by now. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.